we have Christopher McKnight, Nichols professor, author of Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age. Chris directs the OSU Citizenship and Crisis Initiative. He also teaches, writes, and comments on U.S. foreign relations, U.S. relations with the world. There's something about the way you phrase that means a lot. And recently participated in NPR conversations and Council on Foreign Relations events regarding the historical dimensions of the Iran nuclear accord negotiations. Thanks.
So my job as doing the cleanup here means I feel like I need to cover an array of other things that maybe weren't yet discussed. So a couple things to start off. It's probably worth going to the text. Here we are in the archives to say sort of what the executive summary intent of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was. In very short, it envisions a program that will, quote, move forward with an exclusively peaceful indigenous nuclear program in line with scientific and economic considerations and in accordance with an sanctions regime, right? So this continues to have peaceful nuclear programs, right? It isn't zeroing out of all programs, which some people might want to see. Second, so this is an accord or an agreement. What does that mean? It's not a treaty, right? And there's a lot of misperception in American constitutional law related to this, and particularly the public schools as we debate this question. We were just emailing about this morning. So an agreement or an accord does not require Senate ratification. Generally speaking, these are non-binding. In other words, it would mean that a future administration or the current Obama administration could, based on the principles of the plan, step out of the plan. As opposed to a more binding, say, security agreement, you could think to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, right, NATO. This is a binding collective security agreement, therefore subject to an act of Congress, subject to a two-thirds vote of Senate, under advice and consent. The interesting maneuver here is that if a president presents to Congress an agreement or an accord to the Senate, it therefore essentially becomes, by an act of magic, a treaty. So if you don't do that, and that's what this vote in September was about. It was a vote for disapproval of the president's ability to release the sanctions. That's what that was about. So just trying to help us navigate between the sort of thorny language related to this. It's an agreement, it's an accord, it's not a treaty. And therefore, that's why the president has the right to do this. Now, we could get into a longer constitutional law question about it, but that's the essence of it. All right, so why now? Why this moment? And I think Professor Katz is exactly right about a number of the factors involved here. The sanctions regime has been biting a lot in Iran. We could look to a number of factors here. Iran's currency, the rial, has lost 2/3 of its value against the US dollar since the sanctions regime began. You can look to the fact that one of Iran's major industries is the auto industry. It's absolutely tanked. It's the first thing that will improve radically when the funds that have been frozen are released. What were the main rounds of this? Well, there were UN sanctions as well, right? So there was a ban on a supply of heavy weapons. There was blocking of arms exports. There was an asset freeze, and this is the single biggest thing that's been politically charged in the U.S., right? $150 billion that'll go right back. Now remember, the UN sanction isn't about Hezbollah or being a bad actor in the international community. The UN sanctions are singularly about the ability to develop nuclear weapons, and that is all. So if you want to argue that this is a bad deal because it doesn't address those other issues, that's perfectly fine, but that's not what this deal is supposed to grapple with in the first place, right? So there's another argument about whether Iran is a bad actor in the international community. That argument is not the one centered on this nuclear accord, right? Or it hasn't been, and it certainly wasn't in the P5+1 negotiations. This is about Iran's nuclear programs, first, foremost, and entirely. So sort of having dispensed with that, then one question that I think Professor Katz brought up, and it started with Professor Hamblin, is, well, why does Iran seek these weapons at this point? And one thing, a blunt way to put it, that sort of those here who were born maybe in the 90s haven't perceived, is that there's a perverse incentive in the international community today to acquire nuclear technology, military nuclear technology. So people, the post-Cold War moment was this moment of optimism. We could zero out nuclear weapons. We no longer live in that world order. The world order today is you get a seat at the diplomatic table if you have a nuclear weapon. And it's that simple, fundamentally. You can think about North Korea's actions as a great example of this. a nice counterfactual. We won't know how it would work out. If Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons when it left Russia, would Ukraine have been susceptible to the attacks on its sovereignty by Russia and Putin? I think all indicators are no, right? So if you're observing from the Iranian perspective or any other one around the world, what do you want to do to get a seat at the table, to not be bullied by large powers? The single best answer to that is acquire a nuclear weapon, preferably two. Now this is a problem, as Linda Richards was saying, because in fact, we've had this long history, a great history. Here's the history that the U.S. has been a leader on of developing inspections regimes. So since 1945, since the U.S. was the first and only nation to drop atomic weapons, the escalation of the arms race meant a sort of concomitant, had to have a concomitant component of reductions. And the U.S. has been doing this for more than a century. You could go back to 1921 and 22, naval arms reductions after World War I. It's not just nuclear. And essentially that was about the battleship, which was a nuclear weapon of its age. Right? If you could reduce the number of battleships in international military communities, you could reduce the friction between nation states and make them adjudicate their conflicts through arbitration and other more peaceful methods. So, a short history of this is, as Professor Hamblin and others were saying, in the 50s, and the Eisenhower administration joined with governments like the Soviet Union and the British, and here there's a nice corollary, right? The US couldn't get everything that it wanted out of the nuclear accord because it's joining with China and Russia and other nations. This could not be a unilateral, you get everything you want kind of a deal. And that's exactly why more than 100 ambassadors and former presidents signed a letter to President Obama saying, we support this deal. It's not a perfect deal. It certainly isn't the deal that we wanted, but it's the best compromise deal that could come out of this with a number of other nations, other voices and actors in there. It's not what we would most want, but no good multilateral negotiation ever is. And this was the essential paradox that the U.S. had to deal with throughout the Cold War. So you could go to the 1963 Kennedy administration, again working with Soviets and Brits, negotiating and signing the partial test ban. You could look forward and fast forward through time. Democrats and Republican presidents in different moments, anxious to reduce nuclear dangers and tensions and pacify a public that at that time was much more worried about nuclear Armageddon than I would argue we are today, had to push forward things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty under Johnson, anti-ballistic missile treaty. We don't talk about anti-ballistic missile treaties much anymore, but they're absolutely important for thinking about the use of offensive and defensive nuclear technologies. SALT I under Richard Nixon, SALT II under Jimmy Carter, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty under Reagan, right? Bill Clinton, the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty. This is a George Bush move, in fact. New START Treaty under Obama. We could go through all the presidents in the near past and see how many of them pushed these kinds of policies. These agreements really helped dissuade the overwhelming majority of the world's nations from developing nuclear weapons until this present moment. Now the incentives really align against them. So how do we move back against that? How do the nation states of the world operate to again, push to dissuade? You need to find ways to incentivize the sorts of actions that people in the international community believe in. The single best one here, this is a good example, I think, sanctions. So often when you're studying international relations, it's debated whether or not sanctions actually work. And there aren't a lot of good cases where sanctions work very well. This may well be the case study where sanctions had a real demonstrable impact that then led to the sorts of demonstrable agreements that would limit the later production of something as important as a nuclear weapon. And so, sort of going further, placed in the context then of over a half century of nuclear arms control and disarmament agreements, the Iran nuclear accord sincerely doesn't seem outlandish at all. So what surprised me most in the political rhetoric of since the summer, was that it was as if this had come out of nowhere. Well, it hasn't. And a brief glance at the exhibit here, or this history, would show you that these are the sorts of deals that have been worked out by lots of great diplomats, safeguards experts, nuclear science folks, for several generations. Toward the end of dissuading proliferation, the agreement really does provide for a sharp reduction of its nuclear-related materials. A few data points might help us. We haven't really gotten into this. 20,000 centrifuges, roughly 19,000 plus, right? Today, 136, 10 years ago. Okay, so you see where they're headed. Now, what is this deal push for? Reduction, an almost immediate reduction to 5,000 centrifuges, with another roughly 1,000 doing commercial work. After something like 10 years, there's a sunset, potentially even a sunset on those 5,000. You could look to other things, a 97% reduction in enriched uranium. The fact that they can't enrich uranium beyond 3.67%, essentially you need 97% for military grade. So these are really important large-scale shifts. The heavy water reactor at Iraq that will be repurposed, right, and redesigned, so it will no longer have that capability. These are really major achievements, and I think one final comment then to think about. Historians are loath to project into the future, but one way that this may be evaluated, regardless of the final outcome, say, in terms of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, which it very well may, is that this is a piece of legacy for the Obama administration in terms of its efforts to be more multilateral, more flexible, more open to other views, taking the Iranian perspective and trying to aim for a longer-term set of solutions than in the recent past we've been able to achieve in foreign policy. So it may well serve to be a legacy of a new or restarted kind of a foreign relations, which is multilateral, P5+1, right, involves putative opponents like Russia in these international conversations, and does in fact achieve a demonstrable end, at least for the short term and maybe the midterm, of Iran not achieving a military grade nuclear weapon. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.